did, lead us one day to repeat it? And in the end, isn't the human factor the only true difference between us and the enemy we now refer to as the living dead? I presented this argument, perhaps less professionally than was appropriate, to my boss, who, after my final exclamation of, "We can't let these stories die," responded immediately with, "Then don't. Write a book. You've still got all your notes, and the legal freedom to use them. Who's stopping you from keeping these stories alive in the pages of your own, expletive-deleted, book?" Some critics will, no doubt, take issue with the concept of a personal history book so soon after the end of worldwide hostilities. After all, it has been only 12 years since VA Day was declared in the continental United States, and barely a decade since the last major world power celebrated its deliverance on Victory in China Day. Although this is primarily a book of memories, it includes many details, technological, social, economic, and so on, found in the original Commission report, as they are related to the stories of those voices featured in these pages. This is their book, not mine, and I have tried to maintain as invisible a presence as possible. I have attempted to reserve judgment or commentary of any kind, and if there is a human factor that should be removed, let it be my own. Part 1. Warnings. Greater Chongqing, the United Federation of China. At its pre-war height, this region boasted a population of over 35 million people. Now there are barely 50,000. Reconstruction funds have been slow to arrive in this part of the country, the government choosing to concentrate on the more densely populated coast. There is no central power grid, no running water besides the Yangtze River, but the streets are clear of rubble, and the local Security Council has prevented any post-war outbreaks. The chairman of that council is Kwang Jing-shu, a medical doctor who, despite his advanced age and wartime injuries, still manages to make house calls to all his patients.
The first outbreak I saw was in a remote village that officially had no name. The residents called it New Dachang, but this was more out of nostalgia than anything else. Their former home, Old Dachang, had stood since the period of the Three Kingdoms, with farms and houses, and even trees said to be centuries old. When the Three Gorges Dam was completed, and reservoir waters began to rise, much of Dachang had been disassembled, brick by brick, then rebuilt on higher ground. This new Dachang, however, was not a town, but a National Historic Museum. It must have been a heartbreaking irony for those poor peasants to see their town saved, but then only being able to visit it as a tourist. Maybe that is why some of them chose to name their newly constructed hamlet New Dachang, to preserve some connection to their heritage, even if it was only in name. I personally didn't know that this other New Dachang existed, so you can imagine how confused I was when the call came in. The hospital was quiet. It had been a slow night, even for the increasing number of drunk driving accidents. Motorcycles were becoming very popular. We used to say that your Harley-Davidsons killed more young Chinese than all the GIs in the Korean War. That's why I was so grateful for a quiet shift. I was tired. My back and feet ached. I was on my way out to smoke a cigarette and watch the dawn when I heard my name being paged. The receptionist that night was new and couldn't quite understand the dialect. There had been an accident or an illness. It was an emergency. That part was obvious. And could we please send help at once? What could I say? The younger doctors, the kids who think medicine is just a way to pad their bank account, they certainly weren't going to go help some Nongmin just for the sake of helping. I guess I'm still an old revolutionary at heart. Our duty is to hold ourselves responsible to the people. Those words still mean something to me, and I try to remember that, as my deer bounced and banged over dirt roads the government had promised but never quite gotten around to paving. I had a double of a time finding the place. Officially, it didn't exist and therefore wasn't on any map. I became lost several times and had to ask direction from locals who kept thinking I meant the museum town. I was in an impatient mood by the time I reached the small collection of hilltop homes. I remember thinking, this had better be damn serious. Once I saw their faces, I regretted my wish. There were 7 of them, all on cots, all barely conscious. The villagers had moved them into their new communal meeting hall. The walls and floor were bare cement. The air was cold and damp. Of course they're sick, I thought. I asked the villagers who had been taking care of these people. They said no one. It wasn't safe. I noticed that the door had been locked from the outside. The villagers were clearly terrified. They cringed and whispered. Some kept their distance and prayed. Their behavior made me angry. Not at them, you understand. Not as individuals, but what they represented about our country. After centuries of foreign oppression, exploitation, and humiliation, we were finally reclaiming our rightful place as humanity's middle kingdom. We were the world's richest and most dynamic superpower, masters of everything from outer space to cyberspace. It was the dawn of what the world was finally acknowledging as the Chinese century, and yet so many of us still live like these ignorant peasants, as stagnant and superstitious as the earliest Yangzhou savages. I was still lost in my grand cultural criticism when I knelt to examine the first patient. She was running a high fever, 40 degrees centigrade, and she was shivering violently. Barely coherent, she whimpered slightly when I tried to move her limb. There was a wound in her right forearm, a bite mark. As I examined it closer, I realized that it wasn't from an animal. The bite radius and teeth marks had to have come from a small or possibly young human being. Although I hypothesized this to be the source of the infection, the actual injury was surprisingly clean. I asked the villagers again who had been taking care of these people. Again, they told me no one. I knew this could not be true. The human mouth is packed with bacteria, even more so than the most unhygienic dog. If no one had cleaned this woman's wound, why wasn't it throbbing with infection? I examined the 6 other patients. All show similar symptoms. All had similar wounds on various parts of their bodies. I asked one man, the most lucid of the group, who or what had inflicted these injuries. He told me it had happened when they had tried to subdue him. Who? I asked. I found patient 0 behind the locked door of an abandoned apartment across town. He was 12 years old. His wrists and feet were bound with plastic packing twine. Although he had rubbed off the skin around his bonds, there was no blood. There was also no blood on his other wounds, not on the gouges on his leg or arms, or from the large dry gap where his right big toe had been. He was writhing like an animal. A gag muffled his growls. At first, the villagers tried to hold me back. They warned me not to touch him, that he was cursed. I shrugged them off and reached for my mask and gloves. The boy's skin was as cold and gray as the cement on which he lay. I could find neither his heartbeat nor his pulse. His eyes were wild, wide, and sunken back in their sockets. They remained locked on me like a predatory beast. Throughout the examination, he was inexplicably hostile, reaching for me with his bound hands and snapping at me through his gag. His movements were so violent, I had to call for 2 of the largest villagers to help me hold him down. At first, they wouldn't budge, cowering in the doorway like baby rabbits. I explained that there was no risk of infection if they used gloves and masks. When they shook their heads, I made it